In this video, we're going to write code to submit the edit trip form. So we will write the JavaScript code inside the selection of the module because we need to write code for this specific trip. Okay. So first of all, we will need to select the form and then use the submit method. So you're going to select the form using its ID. Okay, and then use the submit method. So this method will take a function, okay, and we're going to give it a parameter event, as we're going to be using the event object. So first of all, we're going to prevent the default submission of the form, as we did before with the other forms, using the prevent default method of the event object. Then we're going to store all the user inputs inside a data variable. We've already done this with the create trip form, so I'm going to select the form, or just use the keyword this and use the serialize array function or method. Okay, so we've already done something very similar for creating a form. Right there. Okay, and just to make our code tidy, I'm going to define these variables right at the beginning of the file. All right. Okay, now to edit the trip, we need the user inputs, but we need also the ID of the trip. Okay, so we're going to push into the data array using the push method the ID of the trip. Okay, so we're gonna send an element with a name and a value. Okay, so the name is going to be trip ID. You can choose any name you like. It just needs to be the same one that we're going to be using in the PHP file later on. Okay, and the value of the trip ID can be retrieved from the invoker variable by getting the data attribute trip ID. All right, so once we do that, then everything else is exactly the same as the code that we have written for creating a trip. So if you go back to the code we've written for creating a trip, we used a function get add trip departure coordinates to get the coordinates of the departure. Okay, so we're going to use exactly the same thing. So we're just going to rename this function to edit trip instead of add trip. And we're going to create this function now. So it's going to be very similar to that function. Okay, so I'm just going to copy the code from this function to save time and change the name of the function to get edit trip departure coordinates. Okay, so what's going to change here inside the function is that the ID of the departure is departure 2. Also, we will change the second function, which will get the destination coordinates. So instead of add trip, we're going to have edit trip. Okay. Then we're going to define this function, get edit trip destination coordinates. And for that, we can just copy that one. And just name it get edit trip. Okay. So we'll change the ID of the destination to destination 2. Okay. And when we submit the request, we're going to use another function. Thus, we're going to call submit edit trip instead of add trip. And the submit function is going to be also very similar to the old one. So let's just copy the code from there and create the new function. Call it submit edit trip instead of add trip. Okay, so the URL here is going to be update trips.php. That's where we're going to send the AJAX call. Okay, and the error div is going to change. So the ID of the error div for the edit form is edit trip message. Okay. The ID of the module is edit trip module. And the ID of the form is edit trip form. And again, the message, got an ID, edit trip message. Okay, so let's save. Okay, so everything looks fine. So we're just going to check something here. Okay. So when we submit the form, we'll still need to empty the error message if there are any errors there. So I'm just going to select the error message and just empty it. Okay. So now let's save this. Now let's move to the PHP file. So that's the file that we're going to use to update the trip details. So it's going to be very similar to the add trips file. The only thing that's going to change is the query. Okay, everything else is going to be the same, because when you are filling this form, it's like you are creating a new trip. The only difference is that the trip is already there, and we're going to use the ID of the trip to update it. Okay, so to save time, I'm going to copy the code from the add trips file and copy it to the update trips file. Now, the only extra inputs that we've got with the edit trip form is the trip ID, okay, which we retrieved from the edit button. So let's define a variable for that. Call it trip ID. So you're going to get it by taking the element of key trip ID inside our post array. Okay. And that's the element we're looking at. Okay. All right, so now when we come to the query, instead of inserting a new record, we're going to be updating a record, and the condition is a match of the trip ID. Okay, so instead of insert, we're going to update the table and set each of these elements, okay, to the value that we find in the form. Okay, so let's start with the departure. So you're going to set departure to the value of departure submitted by the user. And then departure longitude to the departure longitude value, and so on. So just to save time, I'm going to pause the video right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be setting each of these fields, okay, or column names to the value, the corresponding value that you find there. Okay, so I'm going to pause right now. All right, so now I've set all the values to all the column names to the proper values. Now the condition is going to be where we've got a match of the trip ID. Okay, and also we're going to limit this operation to only one record. And we know anyway that it's only one record, so just to be cautious, we usually add limit 1 right there, okay, to say it's only one record to be updated. Okay, so we're done with the query. We're going to do exactly the same thing with the one-off trip query. So all I'm going to be doing is setting the column names to the right values. Okay, so again, I'm going to pause the video and do this just to save you time. All right, so now you've got both our queries ready. So once we run the query and we check, so we're going to check if the query is successful. If it's not, then we're going to show an error message. So instead of saying the trip could not be added to the database, we're just going to say the trip could not be updated. All right, so before testing the code, I'm going to make a quick change inside the JavaScript file. So I've got a colon there. That's not supposed to be there. So now let's save and try our code. So if I change anything inside this trip, then click on the edit button, so you can see that it didn't recognize any of the inputs. And the reason why is because the names of those inputs are different from the create trip process. So when we get the inputs, we'll need to change all these to the new names. So departure 2, destination 2, and so on. That's one is the same. Okay, so let's save and refresh. Okay, so let's change this. Okay, we can see that our trip has been updated. So let's try something else. Okay, perfect. All right. So our edits functionality is now complete. Before moving on, I'm going to delete this button because we don't need it. Okay. And also you will notice that if you try the autocomplete feature right there, it's not going to work. Okay, that's because we didn't build an autocomplete variable for these two fields. So you're going to go back to the map.js file. Okay, so let's open it again. So we're just going to add a couple of other inputs. So input 3 for destination 2 and inputs 4 for departure 2 and another one for destination 2. And then we're going to use those inputs to build two other autocomplete objects. So autocomplete 3 and 4, and then we're looking at input number 3 and input number 4. So let's save and try our code. Okay, and it now works. Great. All right, so in the next video, we're going to write code to delete a trip.